My name is Helen Connolly. I am South Australia's inaugural Commissioner for Children and Young People, and it's my absolute pleasure to be with you here this afternoon. I've been here all day and have really taken on board a lot of what the speakers have said. In particular, I thought the example from Canada this morning had some great lessons in it for us. But I'm going to talk to you today about my recent report, which is I am actually launching right here and now. I realised that I should have probably done some big fanfare and had something happen there and went, oops, I'll just take it with me and show people. So this is my report. This is a labour of love. It's something I've done for the last few months. It's called the Bullying Project, what South Australian children and young people have told us about bullying. And I'm just going to really quickly tell you a little bit about my role and a little bit of how we got there, and then I'm going to give you some of the critical messages, if that's okay. So, my role as the inaugural South Australian Commissioner for Children and Young People is I'm the state's commitment to the UN Conventions on the Rights of the Child. My role is essentially to promote, protect and advance the rights, interests and well-being of South Australia's children. Technically that's 0 to 18-year-olds, but as we all know, chronological age doesn't always fit. So I tend to talk about working with people who are probably around 4 to 21. I spend a lot of time in conversation with children, and I think one of the critical roles that I have is to be their representative voice in places where decisions are made. And it's really important as that senior representative of children in South Australia that I actually spend a lot of time being informed directly by them on the things that matter to them. So how I came to do a project on bullying was essentially when I started my role just 18 months ago. I thought to myself, wow, what an honour and what a daunting task ahead to represent the interests of all South Australia's children. For any of you in the room who like numbers, there's about 367,000 kids that we're talking about. So it's quite a significant proportion of our population. And when tasked with trying to represent them all, it became really obvious that the best place for me to start would be to actually go and speak to children themselves. So I went out on what was called my listening tour last year, and I visited kids in the regions, kids in the cities, kids all over the place. I went to schools and church groups and scouts and cubs and guides and detention centres and sporting clubs and dance troupes and acting classes and you name it. If there were kids in South Australia, I went there. And I had these really amazing, deep conversations with them. In the end, there were about 1,400 and something, 20 I think, children and young people across South Australia who told me three things. They answered questions on what was important to them, what they would change in South Australia to make life better for them or their peers, and really importantly, as their commissioner, what they wanted me to do. So what was it going to be that they were going to judge my success or not on? So in asking them, I distilled a lot of information, and you can imagine these groups were ranged in size from quite small groups of maybe 6 or 7 through to some larger OSH groups of maybe 40 or 50, all answering the same questions. And what they came up with was truly amazing, and I'm not going to go through it in detail, but I do ask you, anyone who's interested in anything that I mentioned today, my website does have quite a bit of information. So my listening tour reflections report is there. And what kids said to me is they really wanted me to do 5 things. At the end of the day, when we boiled it all down, they said, please keep listening to us and hear our voice. Number 1, hands down, that was the thing that kids said. It meant so much to them to realise that they had a direct voice to people making decisions. The second thing that they really wanted me to focus on was kids who are living with less than them. So their second message was, Helen, can you please help the poor kids in our community? And there was a real sense of fairness and who's missing out and who needs to be helped. Number 3 was we want everyone to have an education, and we want everyone to have a love of learning, and we want everyone who needs to be in school or in education to be there. And they had a really strong sense of perhaps the people who needed it most were the ones who were being pushed to the edges and to the margins. So they said, if you do anything, please have a look at what's happening in education. The number 4 top thing that they said to me was, please help stop bullying. And that was a pretty loud and clear one as well. That was, there's a lot of things going on in schools, but not just in schools, in community, in places where we go, that we see people not being kind to each other. And we really want you to do something about help stopping bullying. And number 5 was about, help us have more opportunities. Help us be prepared for adult life. Help us get jobs when we need it. Help us have a voice. Help us be involved in the decisions that impact on our lives. It came out in a whole heap of different ways, but at the core was this sense of, we have a role, we have ideas, we have solutions, why don't you ask? And so I've set out in the since then to say, well, that was a pretty good strategic plan. So I've adopted what they've said in their 5 things and gone about now implementing that in the work that I do. So when I came to thinking about what would be first cab off the rank, and I looked at what was happening around me, there was this sense, and I think Marilyn said, it's time around bullying. There was just this coalescence of events, of activity, of thought, of commentary on bullying. And so I thought I would start perhaps with the bullying conversations. So I decided that what I would do is, before I could do anything to help stop bullying, I probably needed to understand it a bit better. So I've gone out and actually spoken to, I think it's 283 children and young people from grade, I think 10 to 19, from grade 6 to year 12, in school settings and in flexible learning opportunities programs. So essentially, having decided that we would go and ask them what bullying was like, it was a really important decision to be made that said, I wasn't going to go and talk to just kids who perhaps had experienced bullying or had seen bullying, but in fact just to randomly select kids. So the kids in classes all over Metro Adelaide. In doing so, what that meant is that we weren't going in and asking about the experience of being bullied, and we certainly weren't going into a place where we wanted people to disclose things that had happened to them. I was very clear that in fact what I wanted to get to was their ideas about solutions. And in order to get to solutions, I wanted them to tell me why bullying happens. And so I went out and I asked kids a number of questions using, and I haven't got any slides, but I created a fictitious character. And my character was Jessie, and Jessie was androgynous. Jessie, we told the participants, was a bully. They could choose Jessie's gender, they could choose Jessie's age, and if they could just, on a cartoon sheet that we created, if they could tell me, what does Jessie say? What does Jessie do? Where does Jessie say or do these things? And why do they think Jessie says or does these things? So that was activity number 1. Activity number 2 was telling us about the things they're told to do that perhaps aren't as effective as we'd like to think they are. But the crux of all these sessions was number 3, where we said to them, okay, what are your solutions? There's a lot of dialogue around from adults who are telling us what the problem is. We've got lots of research, and lots of research does involve children, but in terms of direct conversations about solutions, what we said to them was, let's create some toolboxes, one for schools, one for parents and carers, and one for you and your mates. And so together, in a workshop style, they came up with what they considered to be the solutions to the issue of bullying in their lives. Now, in terms of, did I tell you there were 284 kids participated and 274 of the activity 1 sheets completed. Discrepancy being some kids did it in pairs, some did it in triads, some chose not to engage in that part of the activity but went into the solutions focus. So I'm going to quickly take you through the highlights of what they told me about bullying. And then I'm going to tell you some of the key messages they told me that they want me to tell you. And then the third thing is the solutions that they've identified. Now, in your conference packs, you'll see the double-sided little cartoon avatars with this. So that's the recommendations they've come up with. All of that is in my report, which is downloadable now. So don't crash my website, or do. So that is there at the moment. So I'm going to just go through what kids told me is bullying. Preface, this is not necessarily the experience of the children who participated. This is in direct response to, this is a bully, what does the bully do and say? All right, so some kids had experienced it, some kids hadn't, some kids were going on what they'd heard. So when you read the report fully, you'll understand that context. But I don't want to be saying this is the definitive, this is what's happening in every community, because that would be an unfair representation of what I've done. What I found was, and I did go to Catholic schools, government schools, independent schools, and those flow programs. What I found was the views and descriptions of bullying behaviour were consistent across school sectors, school types, and locations. So there was nothing different in any of those places that I went. That children and young people describe most bullying as negative interactions about issues related to, and I'll give you in order, belonging and identity was number 1. The use of intimate personal information was number 2. And what I mean by that, and it's quite a tricky thing to kind of categorise all of the commentary, as you can imagine, was things like using something that someone knew about you, like you're not depressed, you just want attention, is categorised in that kind of way. So anything that used something deeply personal and put it out there in a negative way was that one. Physical appearance was number 3, and that's pretty obvious what that would be. And there's lots of the examples in here about what they mean when they're using physical appearance. The next one was slut shaming. That was pretty consistent, so that was in the top 8. And that's things like, why are you wearing those clothes? You're just asking for it, through to all of the other kind of awful things that go along with particularly the shaming of girls about what they're wearing. The next one was race, which was pretty horrid around things that we would imagine. You're a terrorist, you belong to ISIS, you need to go home. A lot of that really negative commentary that we hear in mainstream media being said quite openly by children to each other. The next one was sexuality. Again, I don't think anyone would be surprised. And that's all about pretty typical things. Again, you can read that. And then the last one was specific things about your family of origin. So either information that was known about your family that was used against you, or just general, your mum doesn't love you, you're in care because of what, all those kind of things. So they were the top things in order of prevalence. They were pretty consistent across sectors, types. Again, there wasn't any change in any of that. Children and young people described bullying as being verbal abuse, physical acts, and emotional and psychological behaviour. And this was the thing that was most influenced, as we would expect, by gender, age, and socio-educational focus. So we did do an analysis of the schools by the index of socio-educational disadvantage, and we did find some differences in that space. We found, and again, I think what's really interesting is when I read these things, there will be people who go, yep, so there's nothing hugely surprising in it at some level, but at another level, the level of universality around this is quite interesting, I think, and the fact that so much of this is actually exactly what the research says. So girls talked mostly about belonging and body image. There were physical acts across all ages, so that wasn't age specific. People trying to manipulate others to do things for them was mainly a male to female activity. Girls twice as likely to mention slut shaming and attribute it to a male bully. Sexuality mostly used 14 to 16-year-olds and males. And more boys described the bully as a male. So males described the bully as a male, females half-half. Half of them identified their bully as a female, half of them as a male. So there was some difference according to age and gender around that. Things like verbal abuse, less likely by younger males, and emotional, psychological, highest among girls, and higher in schools with a higher level of advantage. So things like that. So in this report, we've got all that by breakdown. So I won't go into it anymore, but you can see that's the kind of things that we've got available for you to look at. When it comes to describing where, there's a really interesting question. So the respondents actually talked about most of this happening face-to-face. So where they did mention technology, it was in addition to. So there was a very rare commentary that talked about technology online, but bullying online being something that was unrelated. So it was another place rather than a different type that they talked about. And they talked about it being at school, they talked about it being in public spaces, at the bus stop, on the bus, at the sports ground, at the shopping mall, in the mall, at shopping centres, pretty ubiquitous. So there wasn't this really strong sense it was only a school-based phenomenon. And what was really interesting is that overwhelmingly, children and young people had enormous empathy for the bully. So they were able to describe in enormous detail what might be happening for the bully, what was happening for that person at home, what their peer relationships were like, what their individual situation may have been happening for them, and therefore why it was behaviour, not the person. And so the level of understanding in that space I thought was phenomenal. So the sense of what is happening for our children and young people, what they wanted to tell me to tell you and us was that I asked questions of them like, is it getting worse? Is it, we hear about it. And their answers were, it's not necessarily worse, but it is different. And so they acknowledged that the 24/7 nature of bullying and the fact that there is no safe haven does make a difference. That they did talk about there being less physical bullying than they believed there used to be, and more verbal abuse. And they did talk about the impact of media and publicity around bullying, saying perhaps there is this perception of increase that isn't borne out in reality. They wanted us to know that it's not a kids' issue, that it's everybody's problem, and it comes from the way that we glorify toughness and portray aggression and conflict as being cool. They said it's multi-dimensional, and they particularly wanted parents to understand that the impact they have on bullying between children. They wanted us to know that that children can't be placed into bully or victim categories, and that bully could be your best friend. And so it wasn't the other, it was someone quite close to you often. And that children who bully aren't always bullies, and that sometimes the children who bully are the ones who are really well liked by their teachers. They want to know how to respond. They want to know what to do when their best friend is being a bully without it turning on them. And they want to know how to de-escalate situations and support their mates to choose different behaviours. And really importantly, they want to be included in solutions. They see themselves as having enormous resources as peers. They see themselves as being able to be a broker in interpersonal conflict. They want peer-led classes with children, both bullies and the bullied, to actually help them find effective ways of communicating with each other. And they want us to know that punishment isn't the answer. They say by punishing children, it doesn't get to the root of the problem or teach children how to treat others respectfully. And that the bully can actually just make someone, the punishment can just make someone feel inferior, more inferior or isolated and escalate the issues. So that was the really strong messages, and again, they're in the report, and they go into detail about the examples of what kids were talking about when they were saying that. Really importantly, and the bit that I found the most inspiring, and certainly I think the bit that really does need to be taken into account when we develop a whole of community anti-bullying strategy. If we're to get to the place that Canada has got to and others, then we really do need to incorporate the voices and the views of our children and young people. And when you say it, it just seems so silly to think that we wouldn't have them at the core, given it's their issue that we're talking about. So they said that the solutions were that having friends is the most important part of bullying prevention, and that they want activities in their schools and environments that are based on interests, not year level. So they want to build relationships with people who like the kind of things that they like and want to do the kind of things that they do, and not to be restricted to a year level. Because they say is when you have a falling out with kids in your class, you need somewhere else that you can go to have your friendship needs met. But they also said that being taught that friendship is not easy. And one of the things that I'm really clear about is when they talk about friendship, friendships are more complex than they were when I was a kid. So friendships used to be me and my mates in my class and maybe a pen pal in Scotland. It wasn't people I don't know face to face but know really well online. It wasn't friends of friends. It wasn't people that I go into gaming spaces with or whatever it might be. Their relationships are complex, and what they're saying to us is we need help in actually managing and maintaining these friendships, because at the end of the day, that's the number one thing that will actually help us with bullying. Number two is we need to be included in co-designing, not their words, in developing anti-bullying programs. Picking up on what Wendy said this morning, this co-designing without children and young people is not co-designing. They want to be taught specifically how to have those difficult conversations with their friends. They want to be taught those conflict resolution skills, and they want groups run to support children who use bullying behaviour as their primary strategy. They want teachers to respond proactively. They want teachers to ask students if things are okay and not wait to be told when it's not. So they were really clear about the fact that how well they thought their community or their school responded to bullying was very much related to the way that the teacher, the important teacher in their life, responded to it. And they wanted practical, positive communication skills taught by everyone, every day, and that their classrooms to be very democratic and to actually model that kind of communication styles. They also had a lot to say about parents. And And I think this is really interesting. They want parents to keep trying to help. They understand it's really complicated. They understand it's complicated if your child is the bully, and they understand it's complicated if your child has been bullied. They say keep trying to help, but when you do help or try, please don't talk about your childhood. It's really unhelpful. So to hark back to a time that was quite different is really difficult for them. And so what they say is lots of kids don't tell their parents what's happening because the response are either inappropriate, and they recognise that, or just really unhelpful. Because as soon as you take the conversation back to what you did, then it's all about you. And it's no longer about them and what they're experiencing. So it's a really important message for us as parents that we do have to think about the impact we have on them. And they also had a really strong message about when you're standing around in the school grounds, or when you're standing watching the sport or wherever it might be, and you are bitching about kids, we know. And we know and we can hear, and that sets up a lot of kids to actually have a stamp on their head that makes them an easy target. We have to check our own behaviour, and we have to realise that when we do that, we are actually being no better than the person who's bullying. So kids were really clear about the role of parents, but felt that parents were an incredible part of the solution as well. And the really important, and I'm nearly finished, the organisers will be pleased to know, I've got two more. Children and young people said, we need kindness, not punishment. They talked about kindness in the most lovely ways, and this is, pretty cool kind of 17, 18-year-old boys even talking about the need for us to have a better a more kind society. What can we do to keep that level of kindness in our conversations, in our relationships, and in the way that we view bullying behaviour? I thought one of the most, I wrote down, I haven't got it with me, that Wendy said this morning, which was the first response needs to be, what does this child need to learn? And I thought, and I reflected on it this morning, and our first response is, what do they need to change? And I think there's such a big thing between change and learn. And so for me, there's this really strong sense of we need to help our children and young people learn a different way, not change who they are, but have a different repertoire. And we need them, and they said, was learning how to treat others with kindness, respect, and acceptance is not just the preventative measure, but it's also the way we should respond to incidents of bullying in our communities. And the last thing is, if it does happen, if bullying does happen, and this is something that we know will happen, what they said is, we really need good support available. And we want it to be, well, there's a level of peer engagement in that support, and we want to really drive our own agency. The other thing that's really important is that we do need counselling available, and we need it in primary schools and we need it in secondary schools. And that we need it to be delivered by people who are, can give them new strategies and actually take them through processes of learning how to handle what's happened. And that parents need support too in that environment. So they talked about the need for a whole of community, whole of school approach that involves parents supporting them to know how they should actually respond to actually make the whole kind of system work. So that's what I found out. That was for me an exercise of thinking I knew a lot and coming back realising I didn't know very much at all. In 2018, it is different. I went to school in the 70s, I think, and life was different. The world was different. Expectations were different. And so I think it's really important that as we develop a contemporary solution or an anti-bullying strategy for South Australia, that this work and these voices of the children who participated is held front and centre at the core of that strategy. So thank you.